Let me be clear about something that every defense ministry from Washington to Tokyo is desperately hoping you will not fully understand. What happened in the Yellow Sea in the early hours of this morning is not a naval skirmish. It is not an escalatory miscalculation by an erratic regime. It is not an accident of geography or the fog of an unresolved armistice. A North Korean coastal defense battery engaged and struck a Republic of Korea Navy vessel operating in waters that Pyongyang has designated a unilateral maritime exclusion zone, and Seoul fired back. Both of those things happened. Both of those things matter in ways that the official statements emerging from Seoul, from Washington, and from Tokyo are not capturing with the honesty that this moment requires. Having spent years in military intelligence analyzing the Korean Peninsula deterrence architecture, having studied the operational doctrine of the Korean People's Army Navy across decades of development and modernization, I am telling you that the threshold that was crossed this morning has not been crossed before in the post-1953 history of inter-Korean military confrontation. And the implications of where that threshold crossing leads are something you need to understand clearly, because the window for containing this is already narrowing. The vessel struck was a Chomsuri-class patrol killer medium, what the Republic of Korea Navy designates as a PKM in their force structure nomenclature. These are fast attack craft operating in the 170-ton displacement range, approximately 37 meters in length, armed with 40mm and 20mm autocannon systems, along with surface search radar. They operate in patrol pairs, or small flotillas, in the maritime boundary areas, around the northern limit line, the de facto maritime demarcation boundary, established after the armistice that North Korea has never formally recognized. The PKM was operating approximately 2-3 nautical miles south of the L when the engagement occurred. That position matters enormously for the legal and political framing of what comes next, because Pyongyang will argue the vessel was operating in contested waters, while Seoul will argue the vessel was unambiguously south of the established boundary. Both arguments have enough evidentiary basis to sustain competing diplomatic narratives indefinitely, which is precisely the political situation that benefits Pyongyang strategically. Stay with me, because the weapons system that North Korea employed in this engagement tells you everything about the level of premeditation involved. The North Korean coastal defense architecture along the western coast overlooking the Yellow Sea and the waters around the L has been extensively modernized over the past 8 years. The legacy Soviet-era silkworm systems, the P-15 Termit derivatives that formed the backbone of North Korean coastal defense through the 1990s and 2000s, have been progressively supplemented and in some sectors replaced by domestically developed systems. The platform responsible for this morning's engagement appears to be a variant of the KN-01, which North Korea has been deploying along its western coastal defense line since approximately 2014. The KN-01 is a turbojet-powered anti-ship missile with a range in the 100 to 150 kilometer band, depending on variant, carrying a warhead in the 300-kilogram class. The guidance system incorporates active radar homing in terminal phase, making it resistant to basic jamfire countermeasures. The missile flies at sea-skimming altitude, in terminal approach approximately 5 to 7 meters above the water surface, which severely compresses the reaction time available to targeted vessels using conventional surface search radar for threat detection. A Chomsuri-class patrol vessel does not carry the electronic warfare suite or the point defense systems that would give it meaningful probability of defeating a KN-01 terminal approach. These patrol craft were designed for the naval confrontation environment of the 1970s and 1980s high-speed engagements with North Korean torpedo boats and light surface combatants. They were not designed to operate in an environment where shore-based anti-ship missiles with active radar guidance are an imminent threat to their survival. The crew of that vessel had, based on the missile's terminal approach parameters, somewhere between 4 and 11 seconds from radar acquisition to impact. That is not a window in which human decision-making and platform reaction can produce a successful defensive outcome. This was not a near miss that the crew survived because of skilled seamanship or quick thinking. What happened to that vessel was the inevitable result of placing a platform designed for one threat environment into an engagement scenario it was never equipped to survive. Seoul's retaliatory fire, and Seoul did return fire, was directed at the coastal battery, or batteries assessed to have launched the KN-01 strike. The Republic of Korea Navy and Air Force have jointly developed what they call the kill chain strike system, a pre-planned targeting architecture designed to enable rapid strike on North Korean launch platforms within minutes of confirmed hostile engagement. What happened in the hours following the initial North Korean strike was an activation of elements of this pre-planned targeting framework, specifically maritime strike assets firing at identified coastal battery positions on the North Korean side of the NL. This is the part that escalation watchers need to understand with absolute clarity. South Korea did not fire warning shots. South Korea did not fire demonstratively into open water. South Korea fired at targets on North Korean territory. Before we go any further, I need you to understand what that exchange means within the deterrence architecture that has governed the peninsula for 70 years. The entire foundation of Korean Peninsula stability has rested on a particular kind of managed confrontation, where both sides exchange provocations, rhetoric, and limited military demonstrations, without crossing into direct kinetic exchanges that cause casualties and result in retaliatory strikes on sovereign territory. The 2010 sinking of the rocks Cheonan by a North Korean torpedo killing 46 South Korean sailors was the most severe test of that framework in decades, and even that event, as catastrophic as it was, did not produce South Korean retaliatory strikes on North Korean territory. Seoul absorbed the loss, imposed sanctions, appealed to international institutions, and accepted an outcome that Pyongyang read, correctly, as confirmation that the escalation ceiling was substantially higher than the North Korean regime had previously tested. That lesson has informed North Korean military planning ever since. This morning's events suggest Pyongyang has been constructing a new test of the ceiling, and Seoul's response suggests the ceiling has moved. The question that now dominates every military planning cell from Camp Humphreys to the Pentagon's Korea desk is whether Kim Jong-un intended this exchange to remain at the level it has currently reached, or whether this morning's action was designed as an opening move in a broader escalatory sequence. The North Korean strategic playbook, as I have studied it across multiple administrations, operates on a principle of calibrated escalation, each step sufficiently provocative to register strategic messaging, while remaining below the threshold that triggers comprehensive military response. But calibration is an art, not a science, and the confidence intervals around North Korean leadership's assessment of where South Korean red lines actually sit have been shifting, as the Moon and Yoon administrations demonstrated very different tolerance profiles for provocation. Keep watching, because what happens in Pyongyang in the next 48 hours is the actual variable that determines whether this de-escalates or becomes something qualitatively different. Kim Jong-un now faces a decision architecture that he did not expect to confront this morning, based on the reasonable assumption informed by the 2010 precedent that South Korea would respond through channels other than direct kinetic retaliation on North Korean territory. Seoul fired back. That was not in the North Korean planning assumption. North Korea must now decide whether to escalate further, which risks triggering the full kill chain targeting sequence and potentially the Combined Forces Command Activation Protocols that bring U.S. assets directly into the engagement, or to de-escalate in a manner that inevitably reads domestically and internationally as backing down in response to South Korean fire. Neither option is comfortable. Both options carry significant costs. The decision that gets made in Pyongyang in the next 48 hours tells you whether Kim Jong-un calculated this as a manageable exchange from the start, or whether he has inadvertently created an escalation dynamic he did not intend and does not fully control. China's role in this moment cannot be overstated. Beijing is the one external actor with both the leverage and the communication channels to influence North Korean decision-making in real time. The Chinese assessment of this exchange, whether it views South Korean retaliation as proportionate and contained, or as a dangerous precedent that requires North Korean response to preserve deterrence credibility, will likely be communicated to Pyongyang within hours, if it has not been already. What Beijing says privately to Kim Jong-un is more consequential for what happens next than anything Washington says publicly in a press conference. And what Beijing's private message contains depends heavily on how Chinese strategic planners assess the American response posture specifically, whether U.S. forces Korea and Pacific Command are moving assets in ways that suggest Washington is preparing for further escalation or managing toward de-escalation. The American military posture on the peninsula at this moment involves approximately 28,500 U.S. military personnel under United States Forces Korea, supplemented by rotational aviation and naval assets. The Combined Forces Command structure means that in wartime conditions, a U.S. four-star general holds operational control over both South Korean and American forces, a command relationship that has been the bedrock of deterrence architecture since 1978. The activation of various Combined Forces Command readiness conditions in response to this morning's exchange, and there will be readiness adjustments happening right now as we speak, sends signals not just to Pyongyang but also to Beijing about American commitment and escalation posture. Every movement of American assets, every change in readiness condition, every statement or conspicuous absence of statement from Indo-Pacific Command is being read by multiple audiences simultaneously and feeding into decision loops in Pyongyang and Beijing that we cannot fully observe. Japan's position adds another layer of complexity that rarely receives adequate analytical attention. Japanese self-defense force assets, naval and aerial, operate throughout the waters and airspace adjacent to the Korean Peninsula. Japanese early warning radar networks provide critical strategic warning data. Japanese port facilities at Sasebo and Yokosuka support U.S. naval operations. An escalating Korean Peninsula confrontation immediately implicates Japanese strategic interests and Japanese territorial considerations in ways that Tokyo's post-war constitutional framework makes politically and legally complicated to manage at speed. The Japanese public's tolerance for being directly implicated in Korean Peninsula military exchanges is not unlimited, and Pyongyang understands that Tokyo's political constraints represent a potential seam in the alliance architecture that can be exploited through selective escalation choices. Russia's involvement in this picture has been systematically underplayed in the coverage I have seen so far this morning. The defense cooperation relationship between Moscow and Pyongyang has deepened substantially over the past 2 years. North Korean artillery ammunition and ballistic missile technical assistance flowing to Russian forces in Ukraine have been compensated through technology transfers, economic relief, and diplomatic cover that has materially strengthened the Kim regime's strategic position. Moscow has an interest in a distracted, resource-consuming Korean Peninsula crisis that pulls American strategic attention and potentially military assets away from the European theater. That does not mean Russia orchestrated this morning's events. The North Korean provocation playbook long predates the current Russia-Ukraine dynamic, but it does mean that Russian strategic interests are served by escalation and not served by rapid de-escalation, which tells you something about what diplomatic signals Moscow sends privately. What I have not yet told you is where the civilian and humanitarian dimension of this becomes critical. The waters around the northern limit line are also fishing grounds for both South Korean and Chinese fishing fleets. Any significant escalation of naval activity in the Yellow Sea, any expansion of the engagement geometry beyond the immediate NL area, creates risks for civilian maritime traffic that compound the military crisis with humanitarian and diplomatic complications. Chinese fishing vessels operating in those waters have historically been present in substantial numbers during summer months. An accidental engagement involving Chinese civilian maritime assets during a North Korea-South Korea escalation spiral would create a crisis within a crisis, directly involving Beijing in a kinetic situation rather than a mediation role. That possibility, however unlikely as an intended outcome, exists within the operational envelope of any expanded naval confrontation in these waters. The decisions being made right now, in Seoul's presidential office, in the Combined Forces Command Operations Center, in Kim Jong-un's Decision Council, and in Beijing's crisis management channels, those decisions are unfolding in real time, and the trajectories they establish in the next 24 to 72 hours will determine whether this morning's exchange becomes a footnote in Korean Peninsula crisis history or the event that historians identify as the moment the post-armistice deterrence framework began to fracture. I take no pleasure in saying this, but the honest assessment of the structural variables, the North Korean escalation calculus, the South Korean domestic political pressure to demonstrate resolve, the American posture uncertainty, the Chinese incentive landscape, and the Russian strategic interest in prolonged crisis, does not point toward a comfortable and rapid de-escalation. The structural forces are pushing in the wrong direction. My analysis may prove incomplete as events develop, but what I know from having studied this peninsula's deterrence architecture for decades is that the moments when the framework holds are the moments when clear-eyed assessment of the escalation dynamics reaches decision-makers in time to matter. The clock is running. Watch Seoul. Watch the Combined Forces Command communications. And above all, watch Beijing. What Beijing does in the next 48 hours is the most important variable in this entire picture, and it is the variable receiving the least analytical attention in anything you will read in the mainstream press today.